So, Brandon Sanderson just pulled off something that is honestly kind of impossible. He actually forced a tech giant, like Apple of all companies, to surrender 100% creative control over this massive blockbuster movie adaptation.
Yeah, which is completely unheard of. I mean, in the current Hollywood ecosystem where, intellectual property is fiercely managed by these giant committees and algorithms.
Right, exactly. That level of authorial supremacy is just essentially non-existent today. But according to one independent science fiction author, Sanderson didn't actually conquer Hollywood. He thinks Hollywood conquered.
It is such a fascinating inversion of the usual narrative, because the assumption is always that creative control protects the author's soul, so to speak. But the source we are examining today argues that the very act of negotiating for that, control the whole process of embedding yourself in the studio apparatus just to get the movie, it fundamentally alters your ideology. The argument is that the infrastructure itself is this, compromising agent.
Wow, yeah. And that structural compromise, that's really the engine of our deep dive today. We are exploring the highly contested intersection between blockbuster fantasy adaptations and, well, the modern culture wars. And we're being guided entirely by a single source.
Right.
So we are looking at a YouTube video transcript from John Del Arroz. He's an independent science fiction and fantasy author, and his video is titled, Will Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn movie go woke?
Yeah, and that title lays the ideological cards face up on the table immediately.
It really does.
It's a very direct, highly provocative entry point into what is actually a much wider, way more complicated discussion about, how art is manufactured, who gets to manufacture it, and these hidden cultural tolls that the entertainment industry's elite institutions extract from creators.
Exact. But before we go any further, I really need to establish a very firm set of ground rules for our deep dive today.
Oh, definitely. This is crucial.
Right, because the source material we are unpacking today contains some highly politically charged commentary. It touches heavily on left-wing diversity initiatives within Hollywood, and it delivers these really sharp right-wing cultural critique of the publishing and film industry.
Very sharp.
So we need to be perfectly clear with you, the listener. Neither of us are taking sides in this cultural debate. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the content, nor are we condemning them. Our mission today is strictly analytical.
Exactly.
We're just here to convey, to deconstruct, and examine the ideas and arguments exactly as John Del Arroz presents them in his original video.
Right. Our role is basically to map the architecture of his critique. We're looking at the foundational premises he establishes regarding the entertainment industry, the evidence he pulls from Sanderson's career, and ultimately the conclusions he draws about the future of independent media.
Exactly. We're treating it as a sociological artifact.
Yes, an artifact to be understood, not a political platform to be debated.
Spot on. So to understand why the stakes of this specific movie deal are so incredibly high for millions of readers, we first need to understand the architectural weight of the world adapted.
Oh, absolutely. The world building is everything.
Right. We were talking about the universe of Mist. And Sanderson didn't just build some, pastoral Tolkien-esque landscape, rolling green shires and singing elves. He built an absolute masterclass in atmospheric oppression.
A very grim world.
So grim. The defining physical characteristic of this world is that ash is just constantly falling from this unnatural red sky, completely burying the landscape. And at night, these incredibly thick, mysterious mists roll in, obscuring everything. The environment is actively hostile.
Yeah, and that hostility is a direct mirror of the society living within it.
Yeah.
The societal architecture is defined by what's called the final empire.
The final empire, just the name alone, right?
Right, exactly. And this isn't some kingdom in flux. It is a 1,000-year tyranny. It's a society that has been entirely static for a millennium, ruled by this immortal entity known simply as the Lord Ruler.
Wow.
And he dictates absolute law from the capital city of Luthadel. And the genius of this setting, which the source points out, is how it completely strips away all that romanticism usually associated with epic fantasy monarchy.
Right. There are absolutely no benevolent kings here, no plucky middle-class merchants trying to make their way. The source highlights this brutally stark class divide. You've got the noble houses who exist in a state of extreme, almost decadent privilege.
Taking all the political and economic labors.
Exactly. And then beneath them, serving as basically the raw fuel for this empire, are the Ska.
The Sky.
And the Ska are this entirely enslaved underclass. They are systematically worked to death on these massive inner-city plantations and industries. It is a society built entirely on overwhelming, institutionalized cruelty.
It really is. And the enforcement mechanism of that cruelty, the tool that maintains this 1,000-year stasis, is the magic system itself.
Right.
Sanderson is really renowned in fantasy circles for pioneering what are called hard magic systems. And Mistborn is like the prime example of this. The source details the mechanics of this system, which is known as allomancy.
Allomancy. Okay, let's unpack this because this is where it gets really unique.
It really does, because it entirely rejects that esoteric, mystical approach to magic.
Yeah.
There are no ancient incantations or mysterious wands. Allomancy is deeply physiological. It operates almost like a thermodynamic equation.
Right, so instead of waving a wand, magic here is like a dietary supplement with extreme side effects.
That is a perfect analogy. Magic is a biological metabolic process.
So an allomancer actually has to swallow vials containing flakes of specific metals.
Right.
Like literally ingest them.
Yes, literally swallow them.
Yeah.
And once those metals are in their stomach, they mentally burn them to access different powers. And the powers are incredibly specific.
Like, give me an example.
So if you burn pewter, your muscle density and physical resilience just skyrocket. You could literally survive being crushed by a boulder.
Wow. Okay, so superhuman strength and durability.
Exactly. And then if you burn tin, your sensory input is dialed up to a maddening degree. You can see through the dark mists. You can hear whispers across a crowded courtyard.
That's intense. But what about, like, moving?
Right. So the physical limitations of the system are what make it so compelling. The source specifically points out the external metals, which are steel and iron. Burning these allows the user to telekinetically twist and pull on other metal objects.
Okay, so like Magneto.
Kind of, but it is strictly governed by Newtonian physics.
Right. Really?
Yeah. So if you weigh 150 pounds and you try to push against a massive iron door that weighs a ton, the door won't move. You will be launched backward through the air.
Oh, wow. Because every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Exactly. You aren't altering reality. You are manipulating kinetic vector.
That is so cool. And this intensely rigid, rules-based magic system is exactly why Hollywood usually struggles to adapt this kind of reality.
Oh, absolutely. It's a nightmare for them.
Because screenwriters generally prefer soft magic, right? Like a vague, undefined, mystical force. Soft magic is incredibly useful in a writer's room because it acts as this universal solvent for plot.
Exactly.
If the hero is trapped, the writer can just, have them discover a new, glowing, magical ability at the climax to save the day. But allomancy doesn't allow for a deus ex machina. If the character runs out of ingested steel flakes in their stomach, the magic just stops, period.
And that rigidity forces the narrative to rely on cleverness rather than just mindless spectacle, which, as you said, is a structural nightmare for a conventional Hollywood blockbuster.
Right.
Furthermore, the source makes a crucial distinction about how this power is distributed in the world. He uses a really apt comparison to the Star Wars universe.
Okay, I love a good Star Wars analogy. Let's hear it.
So, in the final empire, the vast majority of people with allomantic abilities are what are called misting. A misting can only burn one single metal. They are highly specialized.
Okay.
If they can burn pewter, they're called a thug. They become a human battering ram, but they have absolutely no other ability. The source likens them to being force sensitive. They have an inherent advantage, but a very narrow application.
Got it. But then you have the anomaly title of the book, right?
Exactly. A Mistborn is the exceedingly rare genetic lottery winner who can ingest and burn every single allomantic metal. They have the entire arsenal at their disposal.
Oh, wow.
So the source compares a Mistborn to a full-fledged Jedi Knight because they can combine the physical enhancements of pewter with the kinetic mobility of steel and iron. A single Mistborn is essentially a one-person army, an apex predator in this societal hierarchy.
That sounds terrifying, honestly. And this power dynamic perfectly sets the stage for the protagonist. The narrative basically anchors itself to Vin. She's a 16-year-old half-scoth, and she has grown up completely subjected to the brutal, paranoid violence of the street gangs operating in the shadows of the Final Empire. She actually possesses latent Mistborn abilities, but lacks the knowledge or the resources to even understand them. She's surviving purely on instinct.
Right, she's just trying to stay alive. But her trajectory completely shifts when she is discovered by Kelsier.
Kelsier, right.
The source outlines Kelsier's fundamental role here. He is a legendary half-Scoth thief and a fully realized Mistborn. And Kelsier's backstory is vital. His abilities didn't just manifest naturally, they snapped.
Snapped? That sounds violent.
It is. Snapping is the traumatic awakening process for Allomancer. His powers only snapped after he survived the pits of Halfson, which is this inescapable, brutal death camp prison run by the Lord Ruler.
Wow. So he's not just some wise old mentor.
Not at all. Kelsier isn't just a mentor figure. He is a man who has been radicalized by extreme trauma. and he's orchestrating a full-on rebellion. And he pulls Vin into his highly specialized thieving crew.
And this is where the source, Arroz, praises the foundational brilliance of Sanderson's narrative structure. Because Mistborn doesn't open with your traditional epic fantasy tropes.
Right.
There is no ancient prophet. There's no farm boy chosen by death to vanquish the Dark Lord. It literally opens with the mechanical structure of a heist.
Yes, Ocean's 11 with Matt.
Exact. Kelsier's crew is a team of specialized criminals, mistings with specific skills gathering to pull off an impossible job against the wealthiest, most powerful entity in their world.
And the expert notes that this heist structure is really the Trojan horse for the epic fantasy.
Oh, I like that.
The crew starts out treating this like a massive bank robbery. They just want to steal the Lord Ruler's hidden cache of wealth and destabilize the local economy. But as the source notes, the narrative naturally and inevitably escalates.
Right.
The mechanics of the heist force them to confront the deeper sociological horrors of the final empire, and they transition from cynical thieves pulling a job to, well, reluctant revolutionaries trying to topple a god.
And this specific alchemy, a hard magic system, grim world building, and a heist movie pacing is exactly what launched Brandon Sanderson from a promising author into an absolute titan of the public.
That systemic reliability is the core of Sanderson's brand. The heist structure worked perfect. The magic system worked perfect. And that hyper-structured, almost robotic consistency in his world building translates directly into his actual writing methodology.
Which is fascinating in itself.
It really is, because this isn't just a quirk for his fans. It's the exact characteristic that makes him an incredibly attractive asset to a highly risk-averse market like Hollywood, which smoothly transitions us to the mechanics of his success and that unprecedented Apple TV deal.
Right. So to understand this movie deal, we really have to look at how he writes. And the source, John Arroz, highlights the specific, highly unusual practice that Sanderson uses to communicate with his massive fan base.
The loading bar.
Yeah. Sanderson literally uses a loading bar methodology on his website. He posts transparent, percentage-based updates on his writing progress. You can go to his site right now and see metrics like, Stormlight Book 5 first draft, 80%, or Skyward sequel revisions, 40%. It is an industrialized approach to creativity.
It demystifies the artistic process completely. By applying numerical tracking to drafting, Sanderson signals to his audience and, crucially, to corporate executive that his inspiration isn't some fickle muse that might just vanish for a decade.
Like some other fantasy author.
Exactly. It is a highly regulated manufacturing pipeline. Arroz notes that this is the engine of Sanderson's prolific output.
But, there is a glaring tension in Arroz's analysis here that I think we need to address.
Oh.
Yeah. So the source claims that this highly structured, formulaic approach allows for this massive output, right? But he simultaneously argues that the formula eventually gets exhausted. He says the newer books feel tired because the structural skeleton is just too obvious. Yet in the exact same breath, he praises the original Mistborn trilogy as great literature. So how does the source reconcile a formulaic structure with the great narrative? Arroz seems to be struggling with that paradox.
That's a great point. The reconciliation of that paradox likely lies in the novelty of the initial execution. When Sanderson first applied the heist formula to the grimdark fantasy setting and added that rigid magic system, the sheer novelty of that combination masked the underlying structural formulas. The audience was too busy marveling at the mechanics of allomancy to notice the rigid pacing. But after 20 novels utilizing similar structural architectures, the scaffolding becomes visible to the reader.
Right, the magic trick loses its punch when you see the wires.
Exactly. Arroz is essentially diagnosing a kind of systemic fatigue in Sanderson's later work, where the formula that built the empire begins to feel like restraint.
Right. But regardless of whether those later books feel formulaic to some critics, that reliable output is what generated the economic leverage required to conquer Hollywood. I mean, Sanderson is famous for launching a Kickstarter campaign for 4 secret novels that raised over $41 million.
$41 million. It breaks every record on the platform.
It's staggering. When an author can instantly mobilize $40 million in liquid capital directly from their audience without a traditional publisher or a studio middleman, the power dynamic at the negotiating table completely inverts.
It really does.
Apple TV didn't give Sanderson creative control out of artistic benevolence. They surrendered it because he possessed an undeniable, quantifiable economic gravity that they desperately wanted to capture for their platform.
And he is a guaranteed sell. The source outlines the current logistical reality of this Apple TV deal, and it's fascinating. The project is actively in development right now as a feature film. The immediate timeline is Apple is currently vetting 6 different producers. The script itself has a hard deadline of July 1st, and there's a mandate in place that no actors and no directors will be attached to the project until that script is entirely finished.
Which is wild, because in the standard Hollywood machine, a project is usually greenlit by packaging a major star or a marquee director first.
Exactly.
And the script is treated as this malleable secondary element that can just be rewritten to suit the star's demand. By mandating that the script must be locked before casting, Sanderson is utilizing his creative control to prioritize the narrative architecture over star.
And the source deeply understands why this control is so vital to fans of the genre. Because Arroz invokes the specters of disastrous past adaptation. He specifically names the Aragon feature film and MTV's adaptation of the Shannara Chronicles.
Oh, man. Yeah, those are profound cautionary tales within the fan.
They really are.
They are the ultimate examples of what happens when a studio buys an intellectual property solely for the brand title and then immediately subjects the narrative to corporate 4-quadrant homogenization.
Right. They strip away the specific world building that made the book popular in the first place just to appeal to a broader, focused, group-tested demographic.
Exactly. And in doing so, they completely alienate the core fans while utterly failing to attract a new audience. The adaptation just fails on both. So Sanderson's demand for 100% creative control is a direct attempt to build an impenetrable firewall against that exact kind of executive interference.
It is. However, this firewall creates a fascinating behavioral paradox.
How so?
Well, Sanderson has secured ultimate authority to protect his vision from Hollywood's worst impulse, right? But in order to actually execute that vision to get the movie produced on a massive scale, he is aggressively studying and internalizing deeply entrenched Hollywood methodologies. To protect his work from the industry, he is essentially adopting the very shape of.
Oh, wow. That is a great way to put it. And this brings us to what we can call the script-first Hollywood strategy. Sanderson is keenly aware of how massive fantasy production lab. Arroz points out that Sanderson is trying to idiot-proof the Mistborn production by ensuring the script is bulletproof before a single dime is spent on physical production.
Right.
And to do this, he isn't looking at how other novelists adapt books. He is studying specific, highly successful Hollywood director. The expert specifically cites the James Gunn model.
Yes, James. Particularly in his recent tenure overseeing the DC Cinematic Universe, Gunn has been highly vocal about his absolute refusal to begin pre-production or casting until a screenplay is entirely finished and locked.
Which seems like common sense, but apparently isn't.
It's definitely not the industry standard, especially for massive blockbusters. The standard often involves starting production with a half-finished script and relying on extremely expensive, chaotic reshoots to fix narrative holes in post-production.
What a night.
Sanderson is attempting to emulate Gunn's rigidity to prevent that kind of budgetary and narrative hemorrhage. The source even notes that Sanderson is reading Gunn's script for the upcoming Superman film as a sort of structural textbook.
That's fascinating. He is also analyzing Rian Johnson's screenplays for the exact same reason. Johnson is famous for having an incredibly tight, locked-in script before arriving on set. Sanderson is just trying to build a protective infrastructure.
Exactly.
And the anti-model here, the absolute nightmare scenario Sanderson is actively trying to avoid, is Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy.
Oh, yes. The Hobbit is notoriously cited as a masterclass in production failure caused by a lack of preparation.
Right.
Jackson was forced by studio timeline to begin principal photography without finished script. He was essentially designing massive action set pieces and writing the connective tissue the night before filming.
Literally making it up as they went.
Yes. And the result was a bloated, structurally unsound narrative. Sanderson's ambition to be the sole screenwriter on Mistborn is a direct response to that trauma. He wants the blueprint finished before the foundation is poured.
But to be fair, Sanderson is also publicly managing expectations here. The source notes that Sanderson admits he is only about 10% of the way through the script and feels kind of 50-50 about his own progress.
Which is very honest.
It is. He openly acknowledges the high probability that a veteran Hollywood screenwriter or the eventual director will need to execute a polish on his draft. He also plans to be physically present on set for the entire shoot to guard the material. Logistically, this just sounds like an incredibly pragmatic, self-aware approach to interrupting a mass.
Right. Viewed purely through the lens of production logistics, it is highly pragmatic. But, and this is the crux of the episode, this is the exact moment where John Arroz pivots the analysis away from logistics and entirely into ideological critique.
There we go.
Arroz does not view Sanderson's study of James Gunn and Rian Johnson as an author attempting to learn the formatting and pacing of a screenplay. He views the public invocation of these specific directors as a highly calculated, weird virtue signal.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of a virtue signal in this highly specific cultural context. Why does Del Arroz view mentioning these directors as a massive red flag?
Well, he states that James Gunn didn't do a good job with the Superman movie, which isn't even out yet, mind you, but his critique of Rian Johnson is far more aggressive.
Yeah.
He dismisses Johnson entirely as the Last Jedi guy who ruined Star Wars.
Ah, The Last Jedi.
Yes. By identifying Rian Johnson solely through the lens of The Last Jedi, Del Arroz is tapping into one of the most polarizing cultural flashpoints in modern blockbuster history. The Last Jedi is viewed by a significant portion of the online fan community as a film that deliberately deconstructed and mocked traditional heroic narratives in favor of inserting progressive ideological messages.
So, to Del Arroz, when Sanderson publicly states, I am studying Rian Johnson, he isn't saying, I am studying how to format a scene transition. He is allegedly signaling to the Hollywood establishment that he aligns with their cultural sensibilities.
Exactly. It's an in-group signal.
Sanderson is communicating to the power brokers at Apple TV and the broader coastal elite creative class that he is not some reactionary, rigid fantasy purist, but a sophisticated, flexible creator who operates within their accepted ideological framework.
Yes. The source is arguing that the logistics are merely a cover for a profound cultural assimilation. And this transitions us into the absolute core of Del Arroz's critique.
Right.
He posits that Sanderson's embrace of these specific Hollywood fissures and methods is not a tactical decision to make a better movie, but rather a symptom of a massive fundamental ideological conflict.
Okay, so we are moving from a discussion about the mechanics of screenwriting into a direct interrogation of personal and art integrity. And the accusations Del Arroz levels against Sanderson here are extraordinarily heavy.
Very heavy.
We are going to unpack these claims exactly as the source presents, maintaining our analytical distance as promised. So, what are the specific pillars of Del Arroz's accusation?
The source builds his critique on three interconnected claims. First, he asserts that Brandon Sanderson has, in recent years, quote, sold out to the LGBTQ agenda.
Okay.
Second, he claims that in doing so, Sanderson is actively betraying the tenets of his own Mormon faith.
Oh.
And finally, he escalates the rhetoric significantly, stating that Sanderson's public posturing and recent writing are designed to, quote, virtue signal to the satanic powers that be within the Hollywood apparatus.
Okay, just pausing on that last one. The use of the phrase satanic powers that be is a massive rhetorical escalation.
It really is.
By using deeply theological language to describe corporate studio executive, Del Arroz is completely reframing what could be viewed as a standard business disagreement over adaptation rights into an absolute moral binary.
Yes, a war between good and evil.
Exactly. He is categorizing the Hollywood system not just as economically predatory, but as fundamentally spiritually corrupting. But an accusation of that magnitude requires perceived evidence. If Del Arroz is claiming Sanderson has compromised his art and his faith, what specific evidence does he actually present to back up the claim?
So Del Arroz locates his evidence directly within the text of Sanderson's recent novel. He argues that there is a discernible structural decline in the quality of Sanderson's writing that correlates directly with his pursuit of Hollywood access.
Okay, so he's tying the writing quality to the movie.
Precisely. He targets the later installments of the massive Stormlight Archive series, specifically pointing toward the upcoming novel, Wind and Truth.
Now, it's important to note that Del Arroz isn't just complaining about themes he disagrees with. He is actually making a structural critique here. He states that while the earlier Stormlight books were built on cool, solid concept, the newer entries feel increasingly rushed and sloppily together. He argues that the pacing and the narrative cohesion are literally suffering because Sanderson is forcibly shoehorning modernisms and LGBT propaganda into the world.
The argument is that the ideological messaging has superseded the imperative of telling a compelling story. But Del Arroz connects this perceived literary decline back to the Apple TV. He proposes this unified theory of Sanderson's current career.
Let's hear.
He theorizes that Sanders actively rushing through his massive, long-standing literary, basically trying to aggressively clear his plate so that he can pivot his career entirely toward becoming a quote-unquote movie guy.
Wow. So Del Arroz is painting a portrait of an author who is fundamentally altering the DNA of his original creation to appease a new, more powerful, and he introduces a concept to explain why this ideology occurred. He refers to it as the sellout, but really what he is describing is the underlying mechanism.
The access economy. That's the critical framework needed to understand this critique. The mechanics of Hollywood, and particularly entertainment journalism and elite creative circles, rely entirely on access. If you are hostile to the establishment cuts off your access to capital, to talent, and to distribution platform.
Yeah.
Arroz points out a historical discrepancy in Sanderson's public persona to illustrate this.
Oh, this is interesting. What discrepancy?
He claims that several years ago, Sanderson was perfectly willing to publicly and heavily criticize mainstream prop. He allegedly voiced strong critiques of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and the recent Amazon adaptation of The Wheel of Time.
Right. But the source notes a sudden softening. According to Arroz, Sanderson has recently become way nicer to the Hollywood elite.
Way nicer, yeah.
And this is a classic example of what economists call regulatory capture. To use an analogy in politics, regulatory capture happens when a government watchdog agency becomes so deeply embedded with the industry it is supposed to regulate that it eventually starts protecting the industries instead of the public. It relies on the industry for future jobs, for funding, and for relevance.
That analogy translates perfectly to the cultural critique Arroz is making here. When an author is an outsider, they can afford to be a watchdog calling out bad adaptation.
Because they have nothing to lose.
Exactly. But once that author's agents are actively taking pitch meetings at Apple and Disney, the dynamic shifts completely. You cannot aggressively critique the institutions that you are currently begging to fund your $50 million adaptation.
Right. It's like moving to a new high school and suddenly changing your entire wardrobe just to sit at the cool kids' table in the cafeteria.
That's a perfect way to put it. The edges of your public commentary, and eventually the themes of your art, must soften to ensure you remain in the room where the deals are made.
So, Arroz is alleging that Sanderson has allowed himself to be culturally capped. He is changing his ideological signifiers to ensure he maintains access to Apple's research. But, let's accept the source's premise for a moment to see where it's...
Okay.
If Sanderson has indeed compromised his worldview to placate the executives at Apple, what does that practically mean for the Mistborn movie itself? How does this alleged ideological surrender physically manifest on the screen?
This is where Arroz's predictions become highly specific and, honestly, slightly counterintuitive.
Really? How so?
Well, given the severity of his critique regarding the quote-unquote satanic Hollywood system, one might expect him to predict that the Mistborn movie will be an unmitigated disaster, that it will be entirely unrecognizable from the books, similar to his earlier examples of Aragon or the Shannara Chronicles.
Right, you'd think he'd say it's going to be a total flop.
But he doesn't predict that at all.
He actually predicts that the load-bearing pillars of the narrative survive. Because Sanderson retains creative control and wrote the original architecture, Arroz expects the core heist structure to remain perfectly intact.
Yes.
Crucially, he expects the main protagonists, Vin and Kelsier, to be faithfully represented in terms of their character arcs and their fundamental roles in the story. He notes, rather fatalistically, that Apple TV might try to cast Vin as a, quote, disabled black woman, simply because, in his words, it's Apple TV, this is kind of how it goes now. But that isn't actually his primary concern regarding the adaptation.
Right. His primary, much more confident prediction revolves around what we can call the sprinkled with woke theory.
The sprinkled with woke theory. Okay, break that down.
So if the studio cannot fundamentally alter Kelsier or Vin without triggering a massive fan revolt, and if the main plot remains a heist against the Lord Ruler, Arroz hypothesizes that the modern diversity mandates and ideological messaging will be aggressively concentrated on the minor characters.
The minor characters. Okay, so he expects the studio to alter the backgrounds and identities of Kelsier's secondary crew members or, the peripheral nobility.
Exactly.
Specifically, he predicts the insertion of gay romances or contemporary socio-political dynamics to the backstories of characters who had absolutely no such attributes in the original text.
Right.
But from an analytical standpoint, if the main story remains completely intact and the primary heroes act exactly as they did in the book, why does the alteration of a tertiary background character bother the source so intensely? I mean, why is that the stick?
Because Arroz views the alteration of minor characters not as a compromise, but as a highly calculated, insidious strategy of pacification.
Pacification. Interesting.
He argues that this tactic is specifically designed to neutralize potential backlash from the quote-unquote anti-woke segment of the fan base.
Mm-hmm.
Think about it. If a studio ruins the main character, the entire fan base rebels, and the project fails entirely.
True.
But if the studio only alters a minor character, they create a psychological loophole for the audience.
Oh, I see. It provides the audience with a rationalization to just ignore the ideological shift.
Exactly.
The source argues that when the changes are confined strictly to the margins, even deeply conservative or purist reviewers will capitulate. They'll say, well, the core product is great, so the race swap or the changed backstory isn't that bad because it was just a minor character. It didn't ruin the heroes I love.
Yes. And Arroz points to recent highly successful adaptations like Netflix's One Piece, HBO's Game of Thrones, and the upcoming A Knight of the Seven Kingdom as prime examples of this phenomenon.
Wait, One Piece? Really?
Yeah, he claims the core product there is executed well enough that the audience willingly swallows the ideological alterations they would normally reject.
It is basically the cinematic equivalent of a Trojan horse strategy.
That's exactly it.
The studio constructs the exterior of the wooden horse exactly as the fans remember it. Vin looks right, Kelsier acts right, the allomantic magic system looks incredible on screen, and the heist narrative is thrilling.
Yeah.
The fans enthusiastically drag the horse inside the gates of their fandom. But the interior of the horse is packed with the specific ideological messaging the studio wants to normalize. Once the fans let the horse in because they love the shiny exterior, the messaging is successfully delivered into the cultural blood.
And this leads directly into the most fascinating, glaring paradox in Del Arroz's entire video.
Which is?
Well, after spending 20 minutes aggressively tearing down Sanderson's perceived moral compromises, denouncing the satanic Hollywood elite, and lamenting the inevitable insertion of progressive propaganda,
Yeah.
Del Arroz abruptly pivots and admits that the Mistborn movie is probably going to be a highly enjoyable, well-crafted film.
Wait, really? After all that?
Yeah. He explicitly predicts that the adaptation will be, quote, mostly pretty good and pretty well done.
That is a wild pivot.
It is. And his reasoning for this is entirely based on an understanding of corporate economics. Apple TV is not a traditional studio trying to scrape by on a tight budget. It is a trillion-dollar tech company that uses prestige television as a loss leader to sell hardware and subscription bundles.
Right. They just throw money at it.
Exactly. They do not spare expenses. They hire the greatest cinematographers, the top-tier visual effects houses, and elite showrunners. The sheer application of immense capital almost guarantees a polished product.
But Del Arroz doesn't view this high-quality execution as a silver lining, does he? He doesn't say, well, at least we get a good movie.
No, not at all.
He views the aesthetic perfection of the film as the ultimate ding. And he introduces this concept of prestige propaganda.
Prestige propaganda, yes.
The underlying psychology here is that if a piece of media is poorly written, badly acted, and looks cheap, the audience will instinctively reject it, right? And by extension, they will reject any ideological message embedded within it. The poor quality acts as an immune response trick.
That makes a lot of sense. However, when propaganda is wrapped in breathtaking cinematography, soaring orchestral scores, and masterful pacing, the audience's critical immune system is totally bypassed.
The aesthetic brilliance acts as an anesthetic.
Exactly, an anesthetic. Del Arroz argues that this is the exact mechanism by which mainstream audiences have been systematically conditioned over the past 15 years.
Wow.
The studios produce content of such undeniably high quality that the audience incrementally accepts increasing levels of ideological messaging they previously would have balked. You accept a minor character alteration today because the CGI is amazing. Tomorrow, you accept a thematic shift because the acting is award-worthy.
That is a staggering leap in scope. I mean, we have journeyed from analyzing the physics of a fantasy magic system straight into a deep dive on the psychological conditioning of mass audiences by corporate media.
It really escalated.
It did, and it naturally forces a final definitive question. If mainstream prestige television, particularly from titans like Apple, is viewed by this creator as fundamentally corrupted as a machine that captures authors and produces beautiful anesthetic propaganda, what is the proposed end?
Right.
Where do creators and audiences ascribed to this worldview go to escape the gravity of Hollywood?
Well, this is the strategic pivot that occupies the final section of Del Arroz's video. Having diagnosed the mainstream industry as terminally compromised, he pulls back from his analysis of Sanderson to offer a broader prescription for the culture.
And what's the prescription?
His solution is the construction of an entirely independent parallel economy, a robust counterculture that operates completely outside the jurisdiction of traditional publishing houses and Hollywood studios.
And, predictably, the vanguard of this new independent revolution that he pitches to the audience just happens to be his own bibliography.
Naturally.
I mean, of course. The critique ultimately serves as a funnel for self-promotion. He positions his own brand as the pure, uncompromised antidote to the sellout culture he just spent the video dissecting. He emphasizes his independent infrastructure, specifically boasting about an email newsletter that is 9,000 plus strong.
Yes. And the mechanics of how he plans to bypass Hollywood are really interesting here. He isn't just saying, buy my book. He is pitching a comprehensive alternative ecosystem.
Right.
He lists an enormous array of ongoing projects.
Sure.
There's the Roslandia series, free entry point novel called Night Training to Capture Emails, expansive sci-fi universes, fully funded superhero graphic novels.
He's busy.
Very busy. And a specific series titled The Adventures of Baron von Mommel, which he positions as the direct thematic competitor to Sanderson's style.
So what is critical to analyze here is how he sells this parallel economy to the alienated reader. He makes two foundational promises. The first promise is industrialized output. He explicitly states, if you like Brandon Sanderson's work ethic and output, this is a great spot to land. He understands that part of Sanderson's appeal is the reliable loading bar product, and he is assuring the audience that the independent sphere can match that sheer volume of content.
But the second promise is the real selling point, ideological purity.
Yes.
He guarantees his audience that his work is, quote-unquote, clean fantasy. He assures them that his narratives never go into any woke stuff. He is basically attempting to build a walled garden. He is monetizing a specific demographics exhaustion with the culture war by offering them a safe haven where the fantasy tropes remain rigid and the modern socio-political dynamics of the real world are strictly forbidden from entering the narrative.
And he is projecting a future where this walled garden eventually outgrows the establishment. Del Arroz makes an incredibly bold, definitive prediction. He says Hollywood is on its way out.
On its way out.
Yeah. He argues that the democratization of funding through crowdfunding and direct-to-consumer newsletter models means that independent creators no longer have any economic incentive to sell out to major studios. He envisions a near future where creators leverage their independent audiences to finance and produce their own feature film, rendering the traditional studio system completely obsolete.
Right.
He views his 9,000 subscriber list not just as a marketing tool, but as a foundational node in an economic revolution that will topple.
But, there's a massive, inescapable paradox sitting right in the middle of this triumphlusion. Del Arroz is pointing to a 9,000-person email as ironclad proof that the multi-billion-dollar Hollywood machine is collapsing and irrelevant. Yet, he just dedicated the entire duration of his video to meticulously dissecting, analyzing, and agonizing over the immense, unavoidable cultural gravity of a single Apple TV deal signed by a mainstream author.
It is a profound contradiction that completely undermines his thesis of Hollywood's irrelevance. I mean, think about it. If Hollywood is truly on its way out, if the studio system genuinely does not matter anymore because the independent revolution has already won, why are we spending 20 minutes dissecting exactly which Hollywood directors Brandon Sanderson is studying?
Right.
Why does it matter if James Gunn's script? The intense obsession with Hollywood's alleged downfall and the microscopic scrutiny applied to every compromise made by a reader inadvertently proves exactly how much cultural and economic supremacy Hollywood commands.
It really does.
You do not spend this much time mapping the footsteps of a dying giant unless you are still terrified of the shadow it casts.
Exactly. The video operates simultaneously as a fierce declaration of independence from the Hollywood machine and a grudging testament to that machine's enduring monopoly on cultural relevance. Del Arroz's desperate desire for a parallel economy really only serves to highlight the immense, almost insurmountable difficulty of actually escaping the gravitational pull of massive corporate platforms like Apple TV. The independent creator can build a walled garden, sure, but they are still forced to watch the colossus outside the walls dictate the terms of the broader culture.
It is a tension between the ideal of pure independence and the reality of corporate cultural dominance that the source never quite resolves. And honestly, it brings us to the end of our roadmap for today. We have covered an immense amount of conceptual ground here.
We really have.
We started in the ash-buried streets of the final empire, unpacking the rigid thermodynamic mechanics of the allomantic magic system, and how the brilliant structure of a heist narrative propelled Brandon Sanderson to the absolute pinnacle of the publishing.
Yeah, and then we examine the unprecedented economic leverage Sanderson generated, leveraging massive direct-to-consumer Kickstarter capital to force Apple TV to grant him 100% creative control over the Mistborn adaptation, protecting his work from the homogenization that ruined previous fantasy properties.
Right. And from that logistical foundation, we dove deep into John Del Arroz's ideological. We analyzed the mechanics of the script-first approach and how studying directors like Rian Johnson is viewed by the source as a cultural virtue. We explored the concept of regulatory capture within the access economy, detailing the accusation that creators inevitably soften their critiques and alter their narratives to maintain a seat at the elite Hollywood table.
And we broke down the insidious psychology of the Trojan horse adaptation strategy, how studios allegedly pacify audiences by keeping the main heroes intact while injecting ideological messaging into the minor character, which is a pill made much easier to swallow by the anesthetic brilliance of prestige propaganda.
Spot on. And finally, we examine the source's pitch for an independent, parallel economy and the inherent paradox of declaring Hollywood dead while obsessing over its every single.
So whether your primary interest lies in the meticulous physics of high fantasy magic systems, the ruthless economic negotiations of Hollywood screenwriting contracts, or the ongoing sociological friction of the modern culture wars, this source highlights a defining tension of our modern era.
It really does.
How does a creator navigate the immense gravitational pull and the ideological demands of massive corporate platforms while attempting to preserve the original, uncompromised vision that earned them their audience in the first place? It is a high-wire act where the wind is constantly changing direction.
It absolutely is. And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over today. It builds on the core theme of our deep dive today, but pushes the implication further.
Okay, let's hear it.
We spent an hour discussing an author fighting tooth and nail for 100% creative control to protect the soul of his story from this. But if an author secures that absolute ironclad control, and then in order to get the movie made, they willingly and aggressively adopt the structural methodology, the pacing algorithms, and the cultural norms of the film itself, at what point does the medium begin to rewrite the story, regardless his name is on the title?
Wow.
If you pour water into a vase, does the shape of the container ultimately?
That is the inescapable gravity of adaptation.
Thank you for joining us on the Step Dive. We will catch you next.